that the Johnson Doctrine has two sides. It means, on the one hand, that we will not permit governments to come into being overseas that we do not like, even if they are supported by a majority of the people. But the Johnson Doctrine also means that the government will not permit the majority of the people of this country to have a responsible discussion and to determine our own policy. 400,000 French troops failed to defeat this nationalist movement. How can we expect that 25,000, 40,000, 100,000 American troops will bring them to their knees in one summer? Yet we cannot wait till the next presidential election in 1968. And therefore, I think we have to vote with our feet by marching and picketing, vote with our hands by burning draft cards and refusing to pay income tax, and if necessary, vote with our backsides by sitting in jail. But finally, and most of all, I think that a strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience could be successful because I believe in the power of nonviolence.
We are at 63rd and Western, and this is the building where the draft boards, 32 draft boards covering the whole south side of Chicago, were located here. And we rented an office in the building as a bookstore, and this is where we got into the draft board offices and removed a lot of the material, mountains of files and cards, and burned them outside. We did not endanger the building, or much less endanger the life of anybody in there or anywhere around here.
After the Vietnam summer of 1967, which was a movement, if you will, or an exercise in public democracy, where people went around door to door in neighborhoods trying to talk to people about the nature of the war. Originally, of course, opposition to the war, I suppose, was based primarily on a kind of moral revulsion to the conduct of the war. And there wasn't much at that time, not a huge amount of, or what should I say, geopolitical analysis of what Vietnam meant in a larger context. But that came later.
Today, May 25th, 1969, we enter the Chicago South Side Draft Board Complex at 63rd and Western to remove and burn selective service records. We still have a dream of being able to communicate with this society, but we can no longer confine our peacemaking efforts to the ordinary channels of polite discourse, for we are confronting an extremely urgent situation in which the twin evils of American militarism and racism are monstrously interconnected. The poor people of the earth are taught to hate and kill one another in order that the powerful can enjoy the freedom to increase their fortunes through exploitative foreign investments. At the same time, the expansion of war-related industries diverts tax dollars away from the social programs so desperately needed here. Born and raised in poverty and oppression, young men from America's urban ghettos are forced to burn and kill poor peasants in a land of the third world in order to preserve a quote-unquote freedom which they themselves do not even enjoy in their own land.
After being arrested, we were held in the Cook County Jail in Chicago for some days until we were released on bond. While we were in jail, many friends and supporters came and put on a vigil in front of the jail in support and solidarity with us.
It is not by accident that we perform our act of creative destruction at the Draft Board Center, which menaces the South Side of Chicago. As white Americans, we bear a special responsibility with regard to the selective service system and the war machine it feeds, and we can no longer allow that system to function smoothly in our name, for we cannot tolerate the atrocities it perpetrates upon our brothers in America, in Vietnam, and in other parts of the world. Our action is negative, but also creative, for there is implied in our loud no a quiet but hopeful yes, in our elimination of part of a death-dealing and oppressive system, the prelude to the creation of life and freedom.
So after Vietnam Summer, I went to the University of Wisconsin, and this was a pretty vibrant intellectual community that was rather overwhelmingly opposed to the war, and ultimately it led to National Guard on campus, for example, and so that was the milieu that I was raised in, I suppose. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I went to the Catonsville trial the Berrigans and the other 7 people. There was a lot of anti-war activity on University of Wisconsin campus. There was a huge protest against Dow Chemical and their recruiting, trying to recruit people on campus. And I was involved with a good deal of that. I also later did work with Casa Maria in Milwaukee, along with Bill Durkin and Bill Sweeney. The involvement with Casa Maria and involvement with anti-war stuff at Wisconsin, was all sort of a natural product of one's political sensibilities, I suppose would be the way to put it. What Catonsville was instrumental, I suppose, in for helping gel the idea of more directed action, such as the one we were involved in. And I met quite a number of people at Catonsville trial, and through that network of people got involved in, ultimately became involved in Chicago. I mean, I was involved in earlier stuff that got compromised somehow, that I've never sat down and analyzed how, but which you may or may not know about, previous actions to Chicago.
You were involved in some processes that could have led to your participation in a previous action.
They definitely would have led.
Right.
I mean, they were actions that were aborted at the last moment. And I was deeply involved in the planning of those.
So our people were in this building, and at one point at about 5 a.m., they broke into the draft board offices and started gathering up all the files. And then at one point, they started coming down this fire escape with all the files. I was waiting out here in the car, and I had the gasoline, which we used to douse the draft material and set it on fire. The draft boards located here covered the whole south side of Chicago. And so the people who were registered here were members of minority groups, especially blacks and Hispanics, who were inducted and served in Vietnam in very disproportionate numbers. So part of our reason for choosing this particular set of draft boards was to dramatize that.
Here's what I wrote in a letter home back then. I have 58 men. Only 20 have high school diplomas. Average age, 19. Over and over I read, address of father, unknown. Education, 1 or 2 years of high school. Occupation, laborer, pecan sheller, gas station attendant, Job Corps. They had grown up in the ghetto or Appalachia or along the Rio Grande border or on a res. Kids with no place to go, no place but here. They were expendable, and they knew it. I was the clueless 24-year-old second lieutenant who had been put in charge of them.
So very shortly, the Chicago police arrived and took us away to police station and then to Cook County Jail, where we spent a few days before we were bailed out. We were first charged with burglary and arson by the state of Illinois, and then by the federal government with 4 counts in an indictment, including destruction of government property, interfering with the selective service system, and conspiracy to do those things. And then after a while, the state dropped their charges, and we were prosecuted by the federal government. Jumping ahead to 1970, on February 24th of that year, Judge Edwin Robson issued a gag rule, an order against us that we could not talk about the case. These were his words, quote, "that counsel and every defendant herein make or issue no statements, written or oral, either at a public meeting or occasion, or for public reporting or dissemination in any fashion, regarding the jury or jurors in this case, prospective or selected, the merits of the case, the evidence, actual or anticipated, the witnesses, or the rulings of the court," close quote. That was the judge's ruling, a gag ruling against us. That was overturned, reversed on appeal sometime later. Did you feel that the U.S. just basically had no good reason to be involved in Vietnam, or that we were just intervening in basically the internal affairs of Vietnam? We just had no reason, nothing really to justify our involvement there?
I felt that the United States, as many people did, of course, were trying to act out the loss of the Vietnam, loss in quotation marks, if you will, the loss of Vietnam to by the French, and there was within the American political establishment under Eisenhower and later under Kennedy a sense, obviously, that they put it in rather crude terms that that there was this power gap that was being filled by communist insurgents, and that the United States could not afford to let that part of the world, like a domino, fall.
Right.
And that was the sort of rather conventional analysis at the time. And I think to a good extent, Kennedy was driven by his anti-communist instincts there and later in Cuba. And it was a sort of a central feature of American foreign policy.
Were you also charged with refusing to register for the draft or refusing to report for induction?
Refusing to register, yeah. I was brought back. I was at that time. By the time that trial started. I was already at Ashland, and they brought me back to Wisconsin, where there was a quick 30-minute trial, and they sentenced me to concurrent terms.
What was your participation in the action itself?
I was pretty heavily involved in some of the planning for it, renting the offices and what people did at specific times during the action itself. Cutting the windows and breaking out the back doors and marking the file cabinets and all of that stuff that you're very familiar with. Some of this I guess I would say some of the failures of the previous actions helped with this one.
The window came crashing down, right? The window that had been cut came crashing down on the floor.
So I had a glass cutter. Actually, if I know what I know today about cutting glass and how you remove windows, we would have done it differently. But I didn't. And so I tried to cut a very large hole through which you would climb in the glass. And, you etch the glass with the glass cutter, and then you bang it out. Well, when I banged it out, the whole sheet of glass came tumbling down, which created a huge amount of noise, which was of concern to everybody, as you may remember. But in the end, it was quite good because it made it easier for people to get in.
Right. Yeah, well, I heard that from where I was in the car down in the lot behind the building. I heard the crashing of the glass, and I was quite concerned.
But fortunately, nobody got hurt.
Do not consider our action as an attack on any of you, personally. We mean no harm to any of you. We act to save lives and harm no one. After your anger has subsided, please reconsider what we have done. All of us are human beings, trying to live our lives as fully as possible. To us, this meant action. We're not sure what it means to you. We would like to know. We had to act, trying to end the murder of men in Vietnam and the rest of the world. 35,000 men is 35,000 too many. We act with peace and love. Try to understand, and we will try to understand also. We will learn and grow together here. We are brothers and sisters. Our unity is real.
Our trial was held in the Federal Building in Chicago. Our trial lasted about a month in 1970. We tried to present some of our reasons for the protest action, but the judge basically refused to allow us to present anything about the Vietnam War or the draft. Why did you decide to take a step as radical as the one that we did?
It seemed to me to be the natural step. Remember, I had gone to the Catonsville trial. And by the time people were talking about Chicago, and we went to that first retreat, it seemed to be the most effective nonviolent action that was in play at the moment. You know, I didn't think SDS was making any. They were making a lot of noise, but they weren't accomplishing anything. The one thing that was certain about the Chicago action is it would prevent young blacks primarily from being inducted into the army and to go and be killed in Vietnam. That was the central concern I had, and I think it was a central concern that many people had.
So you mentioned earlier the way we saw the U.S. involvement as a kind of replacement of French imperialism after they were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, so a kind of U.S. imperialist intervention. What about also I think the air war was heating up then, so was the tremendous loss of civilian lives, innocent civilian lives, was that a large factor in your reasoning also?
I think certainly for me, I think for all of us, the carnage of the air war was a central component of our absolute antipathy toward the war and revulsion at the way it was being conducted.
Right.
Not that any war is conducted in a unbloody manner. I mean, having seen a lot of wars since then, war is horrific. And one of the things that made this so riveting for all of us, I think, was this was the first war that was televised live, and that had an enormous impact on people and their sentiments toward the war. And you know, one of the turning points in this, the shift in American attitudes towards the war, was that report by Walter Cronkite, where he was wearing a helmet, was in Vietnam, and saying essentially the war was unjust and the Americans were going to lose it. And that changed a lot of people's minds. people could see every day what was going on in Vietnam, not the least of which was the mounting casualties of American forces. I mean, leave aside the 3 million Vietnamese who died, which was horrific in and of itself. But, there were a large number of American servicemen were dying, and all of this played into the American doubt about where it was going, what the future of the United States was going to be like.
I suppose you've been to Vietnam since you've been living in that part of the world. Have you? You've been to Vietnam. What are your feelings when you go there and you get to know the Vietnamese? I mean, long after the war, of course.
It's an enormously interesting country. I mean, there is no Vietnamese alive who was not touched by the war. Alive meaning even young people, they have their parents or their parents' parents were somehow affected. And 3 million Vietnamese lost their lives in this conflict. But Vietnam today is incredibly vibrant. It is less oppressive than China, far less oppressive than China. There are still rather significant chasm in culture and attitudes in the North and the South. The South, I would say, it's fair to say, bears no animosity toward Americans today. They're eager for the Americans to come. The Vietnamese have managed to put, at many levels, have managed to put the war behind them.
How was your prison experience? Did that cause you to wonder whether our action was worth doing?
No, I've never for a moment wondered that. The experience in prison, pretty anodyne. I would say it was a gastronomic wasteland, that's for sure. But I got books sent to me. I got the New York Times delivered every day. I got the weekly edition of Le Monde, the French newspaper. There was a community of resistors in prison, as many federal prisons there were. My parents were living in Paris at the time, so I didn't see a lot of them, but my brother came through. He was a CO and to visit, and it was a waste of time, and obviously, but it was a fairly boring experience, I suppose, ultimately.
Did you do any teaching of GED? I think Bill Durkin did some of that.
Yeah, we all worked in the same library together. And the idea was to, as you know, to prepare inmates for GED exams, which were part of their parole efforts.
And this was at Ashland, right? You served all your time at the federal youth prison at Ashland, Kentucky?
Yeah,